Thanks a lot, Nick, for the warm intro. So I'm Samit Gupta. I'm the co-founder and chief innovation officer at Alio. As you can tell, I'm not the gentleman depicted on the first slide here, who's my co-founder and our CEO. He typically does these, but he's actually tied up at another conference, at an interdisciplinary clinical conference with a couple of strategic partners, which went very well today, where we talked about some of our latest innovations. That's more where I typically focus, but I've been around from the beginning, so I'll do my best to answer all the questions, but I will give you all a 100,000-foot view of the company. If there's stuff I can't answer, then hopefully we can set up a follow-up to address any questions I don't get to. So my background is biomedical engineering. I'm a two-time founder in the medical device space. My first company was called O2 Insights. We were developing a wearable oxygen sensor for chronic wound care patients. It was acquired by Johnson & Johnson Advanced Wound Care a few years ago. Rolled the proceeds from that acquisition to bootstrap Alio for the first few years. We were self-funded for the first 3 years of our existence, and since then we've now raised over $35 million. We've been through quite the journey to get to where we are in terms of looking for product market fit. Our clinical team, commercial team has done a great job of setting us up for the next phase of success as we move from clinical to commercial. So as Nick mentioned, our focus is on kidney failure. We're a remote monitoring platform for kidney failure patients. So for those of you who aren't very familiar with the space, about 500,000 people in the US currently suffer from kidney failure. Now, the preferred treatment for these patients would be a transplant, but a very small percentage of these patients are able to get one because limited supply, long wait lists, et cetera. So the majority of these patients actually end up on some form of dialysis, and typically hemodialysis. The way that works is you basically get hooked up to a fancy washing machine for your blood 3 times a week, and that washing machine pulls out your entire blood supply, removes toxins, removes excess fluid, and pushes it back in. It's about 4 to 6 hours 3 times a week. The reason we have to do that is once your kidneys fail, you're no longer able to regulate your fluid level in your body and regulate your blood pressure. So your heart comes under a lot of strain and stress. So that's why we have to do these dialysis sessions every couple of days to keep these patients, keep their heart from being completely overloaded. Now, you might imagine for folks like us who don't have kidney failure, if we drink a little too much water, our body says you have to go to the bathroom and you can take care of it dynamically. For these dialysis patients, though, there's no such feedback loop. The dialysis machine will pull off the same amount of fluid every session, regardless of whether that patient had more water, spent more time in the sun, or did anything which was outside of their normal fluid balance. So not surprisingly, the most common complication for these patients is heart failure. These patients are frequent flyers as hospital admits. The average dialysis patient spends 11 days as an inpatient admit in a hospital every year. The cost burden, as you might imagine, is immense. So Medicare spends more on hospitalizations of dialysis patients than it does on actual dialysis treatments every year. So dialysis patients at about 500,000 in the US, that's about 1% of our Medicare population, but it's 8 to 10% of our spend at Medicare every year. So it's a huge problem for the patients, it's a massive disruption to their lifestyle, but it's also a huge problem for all of us as taxpayers in this country. So people are very interested in looking for solutions to this. So what physicians have been able to figure out is what are the key metrics we need to look at to prevent hospitalizations. It's a pretty standard panel: potassium, blood pressure, hemoglobin, hematocrit, flow rate, stenosis, and there's a few others as well, but it's pretty well dialed in terms of what you need to look at, what are normal and abnormal levels. The problem is sampling rate. Right now, your dialysis patient is getting a blood draw about once a month and a vascular workup less frequently than that, usually once a quarter. So what these health systems have started to look at is what happens if we increase that frequency. So the NHS, who's actually one of our partners in the UK, they actually sent nurses out to patients' homes twice a week to get blood draws and do a full physical vascular workup. When they did that, hospitalizations decreased tremendously. The problem was the overhead of doing that was too high to sustain. So what the NHS did was they put out a funding call and they said, look, are there companies out there that can help us solve this problem with remote monitoring and who are actually looking at this problem? We responded, we were selected, and over the last 2 years, we've had a phenomenal partnership with the NHS. So I'll tell you a little bit about our platform. So starting with the patient. We're talking about patients who generally in the US are low socioeconomic status. They're not as tech savvy as most of the folks in this room. So we wanted to ensure compliance with that patient population, make it as easy as possible. So we have a wearable patch, which is about the size of a Band-Aid that they wear on their arm, and they have a bedside hub, which automatically collects data from that patch every night. And the patient doesn't have to do any Bluetooth pairing, no Wi-Fi setup. All they have to do is plug and play. Every week they change out that patch, they get a notification to do it, and that's it. The patch is worn 24/7, shower-proof, sweat-proof. We've had patients go skywalking with it. We've had people go hiking with it. It works, it stays on. On the physician side, this is where things can get tricky for a lot of remote monitoring and wearable companies, right? I'm sure you've heard this pitch many, many times before, where look at all of our data, it's really useful, it's really important. The thing is, physicians are inundated with data. They have too much stuff to interpret to actually manage their patients. So what we did was, we went to the physician and said, look, what are the metrics you care about? What will drive an action from you? That's what we're going to monitor. We're not going to report steps. We're not going to report gait. We're going to report to you what you need to make decisions. And so that's the feedback we got. We've made it very simple as a front-end portal, 3 clicks to a booking. If there's a patient with an abnormal reading, 3 clicks, they can bring them in for a scheduled visit to see what they need to do next. So we've solved the human end of this as much as we can, because honestly, that's a lot harder than getting the electrons to do what they're supposed to do with electronics. So the way we've been able to get these advanced metrics like potassium, like hemoglobin hematocrit, like flow rate, like blood pressure, is through a unique method that we've developed for optical sensing. So the Apple Watches of the world, the Fitbits of the world, they also use optical sensors. Masimo sensors in hospital also use optical sensors. The target for most of these sensors is the capillary bed, which is about 1 to 2 millimeters from the surface of the skin. It's filled with a lot of good information in terms of SpO2 and some other things, but it doesn't get you cardiovascular metrics because you're not looking at enough volume of blood and you're not looking at how it's moving. So what we did with our sensor was actually target deeper vessels in the body and only look at the data from the large vessels. And that's what's enabled the innovation on our side in terms of advancing where metrics can go from wearables. So here's an overview of some of the metrics that we can actually report. At the top, you'll see some pretty basic vitals: heart rate, temperature, auscultation, O2 sat. That kind of is built in and pretty basic stuff. Hemoglobin hematocrit, we are a totally wireless wearable solution for monitoring hemoglobin hematocrit. We'll be submitting that to the FDA later this year. We had a major breakthrough that we reported on back in May with the NHS, which is on non-invasive potassium measurement. So we're the world's first optical sensor that can measure potassium non-invasively. That was reported at EuroPCR. We won the DeHaan Foundation Award for that. And our customer partners in the dialysis space came to us and said, okay, what can we do to bring this to market sooner? So what that's led to for us is we've actually accelerated bringing that metric to market first, alongside hemoglobin and hematocrit. And I'll talk a little bit about timeline in the Q&A if people want to learn a bit more about that. So a quick look at accuracy. When we built our algorithms for every single metric we look at, we go to the gold standard. If it's a blood draw, we compare to the blood draw to build out the algorithm. When we did that with hemoglobin hematocrit, which you're looking at here, we then took our accuracy and compared it to reported accuracy for Masimo and for HemoQ, which are the 2 gold standard in-hospital monitoring products. We're as good, if not better, than both those products in terms of accuracy. And again, wireless, wearable. This data was actually collected in patients' homes where they put the patches on themselves. We didn't have any specialized staff helping them with it. It was all done remotely in the home. So what happens when you can actually monitor these patients in the home? So this is a quick vignette on managing anemia in one of our patients in a clinical study. So this patient was slated to get blood draws every month because they're on EPO. So for those of you who aren't familiar with anemia, it's basically your body's inability to produce red blood cells that makes life difficult for you. So you go on a drug called EPO, which can increase production. As you might imagine, if you're a dialysis patient on EPO, if you take too much EPO, the problem you get is your blood is too thick, your heart becomes strained even more, and you can actually die. So the hemoglobin hematocrit levels being monitored in these patients is very critical. On top of that, EPO doses are very expensive for dialysis centers. So they want to titrate these doses to not give more than they absolutely need to, otherwise their costs go through the roof. So with this patient in particular, they had taken a standard blood draw. Our system was just monitoring that patient. We detected an elevation in their hemoglobin hematocrit, which was abnormal. We alerted the physician. They came in for a second blood draw ahead of schedule, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, which actually confirmed what we read. They reduced the patient's EPO dose, saved themselves $1,400 for that month and in subsequent months. And they could have saved themselves blood draws if we were approved at that time, which we weren't. But the point is, with the right metrics more frequently, there's a lot more intervention that can happen for these patients, and it creates a win for the patient as well as for the clinic. So I'll shift focus a little bit away from the tech and the clinical side of this to what's going on in the marketplace. So 2 years ago, the Advancing American Kidney Health Initiative was signed into law by then President Trump, which basically was bipartisan support to enable more at-home care for kidney care patients across the board. So CKD stage 1 through 5. Kidney failure is stage 5 CKD. So the incentives that have been created through that legislature are now signed into law and now in effect. So the reimbursement has completely shifted in terms of the incentives for providers. Historically, in this space, providers have been incentivized to do more dialysis. You get paid for a dialysis session. Now, with the AAKHI, there's actually a few different models. One is a carrot and stick model. A couple are added incentives for showing improved outcomes. It's the first time there's been massive scaled incentivization for improving outcomes and reducing hospitalizations for these patients. So that's driven a big shift in the marketplace, both for fee-for-service providers as well as value-based providers. We can provide value for both. So through the Tiffany's payment model, that's targeted for fee-for-service providers. You can think of your DaVitas, your Freseniuses of the world, who still are they're making most of their money off every dialysis session they provide. In terms of value-based providers, you can think more about Intermountain Healthcare. They are providers who essentially self-insure their patients, and they want to keep them out of the hospital as much as they can. So with these changes in the reimbursement model, we've been able to generate quite a bit of traction. So before I get to, I think the next slide talks about some of the revenue growth. I'll flip back here real quick to talk about why dialysis is such an interesting market. In addition to the reimbursement changes and the legal changes there, dialysis is also a highly concentrated marketplace. 95% of dialysis patients are managed by 7 providers. So if you think about medical sales, medical device growth, post-launch, generally you have to build up a very large ground game, go hospital by hospital, doctor by doctor to build up your patient population. In the dialysis space, it's different. You have to do pilots to convert each customer, but each pilot you do converts tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of patients. So it enables you to ramp very quickly once you've successfully launched into those pilots and demonstrated value. So in terms of our partnerships that we've been able to secure, I mentioned the NHS earlier. We're also working with Intermountain Healthcare. They're also an investor in the company. We've been able to launch pilots with several other providers, and we're in the process of doing more of those over the course of the next year for the various metrics, whether it's potassium, hemoglobin hematocrit, or flow rate. So now I'll circle a little bit back to the platform and what it means from a competition standpoint. In the dialysis space, there's not really much competition for remote monitoring. Most of the focus has been on improving in-center hemodialysis care. There are providers like BioIntelliSense who are starting to make a move there, but we're quite differentiated because most of the providers we've seen in the space are either providing single metric EKG like iRhythm, or they're providing more wellness metrics like heart rate, steps. They're not really moving beyond that. That would be your Vital Connects, BioIntelliSense, and of course Apple Watch and Fitbit. So the platform opportunity for this company is quite interesting, not just in dialysis, but also when you look beyond dialysis. The complications that dialysis patients suffer from, whether it's a vascular blockage, whether it's heart failure, are actually highly relevant in other disease states. If a dialysis patient has a heart failure issue, they're treated by a cardiologist. If they have a vascular blockage, they're treated by a vascular surgeon. So the natural growth for this company beyond dialysis is interesting because the physicians we would be marketing to in those disease states already would have had exposure to our product, already would have had exposure to what we can do. So the platform is quite interesting in terms of long-term growth. Here's an interesting revenue chart showing that. I won't spend a lot of time here, but happy to take follow-up questions on this if there's interest. Where we are right now as a company is we just closed a Series B on June 30th for $20 million. We announced that close, and we had received significant inbound upon announcing that close. So we've had multiple large dialysis organizations reach out to us asking for customer pilots. We've also had a large medical device strategic, essentially in late diligence now, basically stepping forward and saying they want to partner with us and also invest with us. So what we've done is we've actually opened up another $20 million for investment for interested parties. And this is largely focused on commercialization and growth so that we can actually service the increased demand. So of that $20 million, about half of it soft committed from the medical device strategic as well as from one of our customer partners. And until October 1st, it will be at the same valuation as the Series B we closed on June 30th. Before I wrap up with the presentation part of this, I just want to talk a little bit about our team. We have an amazing team. I think 12 exits, or 13 now, 13 exits historically amongst all of our full-time team members. I only account for one of those. A couple of our folks have been around the block quite a bit and are extremely valuable. Our head of R&D actually developed the telemetry system for the Google Smart Contact Lens, and our VP of Engineering also developed the world's largest distributed sensor network. So we've got a phenomenal team with a great combination of tech and medical backgrounds, and we're looking to grow it with this over the next year or two as we get to market. With that, I'll pause and take any questions, and if there's stuff I can't answer, I will ask you if we can set up some follow-up later on with Dave.
What was the Series B valuation?
It was an $80 million pre-money valuation.
What does your IP look like?
Good question. So we have 8 different families filed. So we've got 9 allowances and across the globe, and 25 in process, 25 patents in process. And we've taken a strategy where we look at keeping some of our IP as trade secret and some of it as filed. So algorithms we tend to keep trade secret because that's tough to get broad coverage on, and you have to report every single thing you do just to get an allowance. So there's not much strategic value to that. The strategic value, though, is in really protecting the hardware and that platform. So most of our filings are predicated around the hardware, the system, and the methods of using that hardware, but we don't get into the algorithms with our IP.
I remember at one point, Alio developed some technology to spray print sensors onto arterial stents. And they've set that aside to better deal with kidney disease. But they know how to do it. They're going to do it again someday.
Thanks.
So, I'm just curious, what do these cost to produce, and do you have ability to further miniaturize what you have?
Great question. So everything we're doing in terms of the sensing hardware is actually, it's off the shelf. You can actually buy the components from any of the providers. So in terms of mass production, that's not a problem for us. We've already partnered with Minitronics Medical in the US for our scale manufacturing. We have a couple other providers as well that we have as backup, but we've already done that manufacturing transfer process. So we can get to volume pretty readily. In terms of miniaturizing, there is capacity to go smaller if you do less sensors and if you modify your use case to do something more like a recharge model rather than keeping the battery as it is. But there's not a lot of motivation to do that beyond where we are right now for this particular use case with dialysis. You want it to be large enough that it's noticeable, not too large for the arm. But as we start looking at things like ICU and stroke, and I didn't want to bog us down by getting into all the future applications, that's definitely a focus for us, which is thinning out, getting smaller to get to different application areas, and that's certainly possible.
You mentioned natural expansion potentially to other CPRN conditions. I'm just kind of curious if this is something you're already able to do, and then kind of thinking through in terms of potential barriers to adoption, the reality that those are all conditions that are managed by different specialists.
Great question. So the big reason to start, there's many reasons to start with dialysis, not the least of which is the huge need. But these are really complicated patients, and they do have to be managed by different specialties, but you can go to one place, right, to get access to those patients. I would say the answer to your question is in two parts. One is the reason we didn't start with PAD or heart failure is exactly what you mentioned, where you do have a lot more distribution and fragmentation in those other care segments. So that's why we don't necessarily want to start there. But what I can say is with our clinical partnerships that we've already established, we're already getting that interest from the other specialty areas of, hey, when is this going to be ready to monitor a FEMPOP bypass? When is this going to be ready for my ICU? When is this going to be ready for all my heart failure patients? There's a journey to get there, but it's nice to have the pull from the physicians that are already getting exposed to the patient population in dialysis, that they're already getting a chance to interact with that. So am I answering your question, or?
Yeah, I mean, you're getting towards it. I guess I'm just trying to think a little bit about like when, like the actual use case, once we're actually getting into patients and thinking about how to sustain that interest beyond just the dialysis-focused area.
Yeah, so in terms of timing, what I would say is probably late next year is when we would start to look at setting up pilots in, I'll say, adjacent areas. We already have pilots running for the ICU use case, and that's partially funded by our work with the military. We're doing some warfighter monitoring in the battlefield, and that has a lot of applications towards ICU applications. So the way we would enter those areas is through clinical pilots, which would then convert into a commercial relationship. So I would say revenue in those areas is down the road a bit. That's a great question for Dave, but what I can say is the partnerships have started already, but it's the early days in terms of setting up those pilots. Sorry if I'm not being as specific as you wanted, but hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to give you a chance to briefly comment a little bit more on the competitive advantage that you have in terms of sensing versus your other competitors in terms of sensing capacity and technology.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of where the world is right now, we're certainly ahead of the other wearable companies in terms of the metrics we can provide. Nobody else is doing potassium, hemoglobin, hematocrit. There's a bunch of companies that are focused on single metrics. You'll see a lot of companies out there for trying to get cuffless blood pressure. You'll see companies out there trying to expand what you can do with the EKG. But at the same time, it's a head start. It's not an insurmountable advantage. That's how we always look at the world. So for us, in terms of building out that moat and how we view ourselves, a lot of our moat comes from the clinical work we do with establishing a footprint in the space with a large volume of patients, large volume of providers. we can actually create quite the interesting barrier to entry, maybe not to demonstrate a capability, but to actually flip the customer. So for us, we recognize we have a head start, but the way we're going to convert that into a sustained advantage is by executing on our pilots and converting customers. Did that address what you were looking for, or were you trying to scratch at something different?
No, that's directly at it. I guess I think out 3 to 5 years when you have executed on these pilots and it's functioning, technology, especially digital technology being what it is, and sensor tech capacity, you know, do you have intellectual property that prevents someone else from leapfrogging you?
We do. So we have issued IP on our wearable platform on the sensors, the way we utilize it. So we have hardware, system, and methods patents issued and allowed on that, and several other in process. I think we all know how patent prosecution tends to go as well. So I'm trying to be as realistic as I can in terms of saying, hey, we've got a head start. I feel very confident in saying that, but we're realistic as well about we have to do more to continue to convert that into a sustained advantage. There was somebody. Oh.
I just have a very basic question. You know, in the handout you have that another company in the industry is trading at 67 times trailing 12 months revenue. Do you have revenue? And what would your metric be under that?
So where we are right now in terms of revenue is we're generating revenue off of a contract with the U.S. Air Force for working with their Air Force Special Ops Command. In terms of dialysis revenue, that's slated to kick off next year in 2022. So in terms of ramping to a point where we would be talking about an IPO, we're probably about 2 years out from that. I certainly hope we get 67x for us if we get to that point. But typically what we've seen with iRhythm is probably a good comp as well. If you want to be more on the conservative side, they tend to be around 10 to 12x, as well as Dexcom. They tend to be in that range as well. So pretty healthy multiples in the remote monitoring space that we've seen. But we do have to see, this is not my bailiwick as well. So certainly a good follow-up question for someone who's more financially oriented on our team. But in general, that's how we've thought about and talked about it.
The federal projects, how reliable are they with respect to line of visibility to revenue? Meaning they have very long cycles, and also the probability to hit those accounts are not very easy. I mean, not predictable. Then most of the time you need to really partner with fairly large, other contractors. So the entry barriers are very high and not predictable. Do you have commercial business plan, meaning in the value medicine paradigm, where do you fit, who pays for it, what's the driver for someone to pay for it? Is it aligned with the CPT code?
So you're asking in the dialysis space specifically? Yes. Yeah, so in terms of existing CPT codes, there are existing CPT codes for remote monitoring that we qualify for. And this is what I was speaking to earlier in terms of, let me see if I can flip back. Yeah, so in terms of where the world is going and where the world is in terms of legislatures, there was a big sea change in 2019 with the AAKHI. So the whole thrust of that legislation and the new payment models that have come out of that legislation have been directly focused on incentivizing home-based monitoring and home-based care. And that's irrespective of whether it's a value-based provider or if it's a fee-for-service provider. So there's add-on payments for the fee-for-service providers that we directly enable through our platform. And there's also enhanced reimbursement for value-based providers that we would enable. So the cycle times certainly can be long, but what's different about this population is typically the complication rate is so high that you're not looking at a 3-4 year follow-up period to see an event like you would, for instance, with heart failure. With these patients, there's going to be a complication that you're going to have an opportunity to prevent or mitigate with this. So the long range nature of it is somewhat capped in terms of being able to get to a reliable end to show value. Did I speak to your question? Okay, yeah, certainly. I think he has been waiting very patiently.
I was just curious about the readout in the by the doctor. Does he get alerts if there's something that's actionable that has to be done quickly, or does he have to go into the file and find out and look into it? Because that sounds okay for like 5 to 10 patients, but I could see that could be relatively problematic.
Hundreds of patients, right? That
Yeah.
sounds like a lot. A great
And
way.
my second question is, was my question better than the last one when you said it was a great question? I just want to know if it was a great question.
The thing, you know what? This is why Dave usually does these things. He doesn't get into traps by calling every question great, right? So the first question, it's an important one. So maybe I'll dive a little bit into the nature of the dialysis space to address it. That is what you outlined is the challenge for any remote monitoring platform to get traction within the medical space. What's unique about dialysis is there's existing infrastructure within the dialysis center paradigm where the doctor does not have to go in. There's actually a dialysis center manager whose half their job or 75% of their job is managing diagnostic reports for the patients. And if something is out of whack, they notify the doctor. Right now, what that person has to do is go through the pages and pages of lab results and say, hey, the hemoglobin was abnormal on the last blood draw for John Smith. Doc, can you take a look? What we've done for that person is created a web portal where they can just log in, and the first thing that shows up is if anyone's abnormal, there's a notification, and it's right there for them to click on and look at. If they want to go back and do a full detailed trendline report on any patient, even if they have normal values, they can click through and do that, but we surface those actionable patients right up front. And because that infrastructure is there with the dialysis center manager, we're not asking the doctor to do something that they don't already do. As far as the doctor's concerned, they're still getting a pull from their center manager saying, John Smith is abnormal, but that center manager now can be, their time can be much more well spent because they're not having to chase things down through pages and pages of reports.
Thank you, Samit. Interesting fact. Alio Medical's offices are in San Francisco, about 2 blocks from Wearable Labs' offices in San Francisco.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
We need to, we'll have
You
to
guys
get
need to
together at
hang
Blue
out.
Bottle or something.
And both sensor companies.
Oh, cool.
So, yeah.